Nice to be back with you again today. And I'm going to do something we haven't done together for a while. We have now concluded our long, in-depth lecture series on rising inequality in the United States. And for today's class, I'm going to do a one-off lecture on what's happening in American politics. And I imagine many of you were watching the Democratic National Convention the last few nights, or if you weren't watching it directly, you were at least reading about it and seeing the highlights. And so I am going to focus a little bit on what happened in the convention, but before I do that, I'm going to spend a little bit of time giving you an overview of the state of the race at the moment. So let me get into my presentation for you. Give me one moment. I'm sorry, I'm having a little trouble finding it. It's peculiar. I don't think I've ever had this problem before. Let me just see something here for a moment. If it's got the wrong name. Yes, it for some reason it had the wrong name. Okay, so now we are where we need to be. And I'll just jump right in. And so I'm obviously going to focus on the Democratic National Convention, and we're at the midway point, right? We have back-to-back weeks of nominating conventions, and we will talk next week together about what happened with the Republican nominating convention. But before I do that, I do want to give you a sense of where things stand in terms of the state of the race right now. And I believe I've shown you a diagram like this a few weeks ago. And if you remember, I believe that the diagram I showed you several weeks ago had exactly these same numbers. I'm not showing you the same diagram. This was updated this morning on the most recent data. I'll talk with you a little bit about how this works in a moment. This is not a poll, right? This is a model, and so unlike a poll, a model builds in a lot more factors. A poll really is just a snapshot, right? It says right now, if people were to vote, who would they vote for, or at least who would they tell pollsters who they would vote for. A model builds in a variety of other factors. And as you can see, this is the model from 538, which is, I think, the most sophisticated model that we have right now. 538 is a website run by Nate Silver, and that has many of the most interesting young pollsters, statisticians working for it right now. And I'll tell you a little bit more about how the model works. But the thing to see in the first instance is that when they try to predict, not just based on polls, but based on how the economy is doing, what's happening with the virus, understandings of the degree of volatility in the electorate and in the news cycle right now, taking all of that into account, what is the likelihood that each of these two candidates will win in November, in roughly 80 days, right? And what they find is that there's about a 3/4 chance that Biden will win and about a 1/4 chance that Trump will win. Now, the way this works, and I want to be clear about this, is that they have a computer model that then runs simulations, right? And so the reason to do this is to try to recognize that predictions are inherently uncertain. We can't with any clarity, say for sure which factors are going to change at the state level, at the national level, with the virus, with the economy, with the candidates themselves. And so rather than trying to do this all in for once, this model runs 40,000 simulations, 40,000 simulations a day, by the way. And so based on those simulations, they get basically 23% of the simulations with Trump winning, and around 27% of the simulations with Trump winning, 73% of the simulations with Biden winning. And I think the thing to notice here is the way in which this model works is really by predicting state by state. And of course, as we know, the winner of the national popular vote does not become president. The person who becomes president is the person who wins the electoral college vote, and that is determined by what happens at the state level, right? And so this diagram, which is a little tricky to read, looks like a snake, is actually capturing the state level data. I wish they presented it in a slightly clearer format, but what you can see when you look down here is that you've got Vermont and Hawaii and Washington, D.C. and Massachusetts and California, the most solidly Democratic states. And these are ranked in the order of likelihood or certainty that they're going to go Democratic. And similarly up here, you have the most Republican states. So you've got Wyoming and West Virginia and Idaho and Oklahoma being solidly in Trump's favor. And then you go up in each side and you see the states that are more uncertain, right? And so on the Republican side, Georgia, Ohio, North Carolina, Iowa are the states that are more likely to possibly tip Democratic. And then when you get to the light blue here, right, you've got the states that currently, based on this model, are predicted to vote for Joe Biden, but the prediction is a weak and uncertain prediction. And so what you can see here is that Arizona, Florida, Minnesota, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, right? And of course, those are all states that Donald Trump won in 2016 and that were critical to his path to victory. And so I just want to spend a moment actually drilling down at the state level. And so before I do that, I'm sorry, let me just point out that one of the striking features of this, and so this model has only been up and running for a couple of weeks now, but they did a retroactive analysis going all the way back to the beginning of June. And what you can see is for this entire summer, there's been a very stable lead for Joe Biden over Donald Trump. I believe that Donald Trump and his campaign organization detected very early on the advantage that Joe Biden would have in states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and that's part of the reason the president was eager to damage Joe Biden early in ways that ultimately led to his impeachment. And this is then part of the way in which I think this election is unusual among recent elections. And one of the things that we've experienced in recent elections is a fairly high degree of volatility, That is to say, candidates go up and down in the polls quite dramatically. And what we're seeing in this is the opposite, stability, right? And so a stable lead for Joe Biden that moves from the low 70s to the low 80s, but tends to be in the mid 70s, and a fairly stable position for Donald Trump, where his best outcomes represent about where he is right now, or maybe just a little bit better. And then he's occasionally dropped down to a worse position. I'll say a little bit more about the stability here. I think it does have something to do with voters having minds made up about Joe Biden and Donald Trump. These are two people they feel they know reasonably well. But it also has something to do with the degree of partisan polarization in our country, and the fact that there are fewer and fewer undecided or swing voters, people who make up their minds in the current election about who they're going to favor, as opposed to people who go into the election with a very stable partisan identity already in place. And so perhaps this is idiosyncratic to this election. Perhaps this is a new trend in American politics, but some of the volatility that we've seen in the past is not present so far in this election. Of course, we do have 2.5 months until the vote will actually be cast, and that's several eternities in American politics, and so it's possible volatility will return. Let's look now at the state level. And if you remember, right, just going back here, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Florida, Arizona, those are the states that Donald Trump carried in 2016 that Joe Biden is currently carrying. And part of the reason that Joe Biden is currently favored to win the election. And I wanted to just look at two of them for you. One of them is Pennsylvania. And here Biden is polling right about at his national average, maybe just a little bit better. And that's a little surprising in the sense that Pennsylvania is a little bit more conservative as a state than the nation as a whole. And yet Biden is actually doing a little bit better in Pennsylvania than he is doing in the nation as a whole. And I believe part of that has to do with the fact that he was born in Pennsylvania. Part of it has to do with the fact that he has better credibility with white working class Americans. And when I say credibility, support from, trust with, when we look at the polls, it turns out Joe Biden is harder to demonize as a left-leaning, liberal, urban, elite politician, right? Hillary Clinton fell into that trap, and a large part of the reason she lost in the states that ultimately decided the election is that the white working class abandoned Hillary Clinton and the Democrats in 2016. Joe Biden is doing better in that regards, and I think that's really important in Pennsylvania. I'll get a little bit more into the demographics of this, but I'll point out that in a state like Pennsylvania, the suburbs are going to be extremely important, and in particular, how women vote in the suburbs. And what we're seeing right now is Biden doing very well with female voters in the suburbs. And this reflects the fact that in part, Biden, as I've said, seems credible to them. In part, Donald Trump has driven these voters away. Now, again, just looking at the stability here. And I'm sorry, this is now Florida, I believe. Let me move forward here for a moment. Yeah, I'm sorry, that data was for Florida. And let me just point out that in Florida, Trump is doing a little bit better than his national average. And that's unsurprising, right? Florida is a more conservative state than much of the rest of the nation. It has primarily elected Republican officials at the state level as well as to national office. It did vote for Donald Trump in 2016, and yet Biden is currently favored to win Florida by about 2-1 in terms of probability. Now, that's obviously worse than the national average, but I would just point out to you, I say Florida exclamation mark. If Trump loses Florida, it's very hard to see a scenario in which he assembles a electoral college majority. And so the data on Florida, I think, has to be particularly troubling for the Trump campaign. I'll just give you a little bit more information on the state level polling. As I say, this model is not built on polling alone. It's built on economic data. It's built on data about the virus and about the confidence that people have in the current leadership or their desire for a change in leadership because of the way the pandemic is being managed. But it does build on polls as well. And what you can see here is the polls for Pennsylvania. All of them show Biden with a lead. You can see the range is from 3% to 9%. I should have said this at the outset. In a sense, it's obvious, I hope, but none of these polls and this model in general does not yet take into account what happened over the last 4 days, the primary. And again, this is an unusual situation with the primaries going back to back. We'll talk more about them being online or virtual as well. But one generally expects a candidate to get a bounce coming out of their convention. The fact that the conventions are back to back may mitigate some of that bounce. But all that to say, this data is all from the first week of August, the middle of August, or late July. Similarly, when it comes to, and I just showed you, oh, I'm sorry. I thought I had the Florida data on here as well. I do not. Give me a moment. Let me see if I can find that data for you. If I can do this quickly, I will. If not, I will simply move on and share the data from Florida with you. So let me see. No, I don't think I'm going to be able to find it for you quickly. So let me get back to the presentation and just point out to you that the data from Florida is not as robust for Biden. The majority of the polls show Biden leading in Florida by around 4 to 6%, but there are some polls that also show Donald Trump in the lead or a dead heat. So that's just to give you a sense of the state of the election right now. And I wanted you to have that background to then think about what happened at the DNC. The Democratic Nominating Convention concluded last night with Joe Biden's acceptance speech. And I want to just spend a few minutes giving you a little bit of analysis of this. And I want to start by noting that this is the first convention in the television era. right? The modern era of nominating conventions, where it was not a live in-person convention because of the coronavirus, because of the associated risks with transmission, because of the need to protect the delegates, the candidates, the elected officials. This convention took place entirely in remote locations that were then integrated using computer and television technology. Frankly, it felt a little bit like a very long infomercial. I don't know if you had that impression as well, but there was much more centralized control. The vast majority of it was pre-recorded, and so that lets there be multiple takes and some editorial decision making by the Biden campaign and the Democratic Party. But it is also the case that it was much more easily scripted because there was not a cheering crowd in the background. And so this allowed those who spoke to concentrate on what they wanted to say and to be able to say more. And I haven't seen an analysis of this yet, and I'm not going to conduct it myself, but I'd be willing to bet that if you looked at just the words spoken in this convention and compared it with the words spoken in conventions in the past, just the volume of actual content, you would find that there was at least twice as much said in this convention as had been said in previous conventions. And that's because in the absence of a live crowd, in the absence of the logistics that come with transitioning between speakers, there were fast, almost seamless transitions, and people got to speak in an uninterrupted way. There was an opportunity for much more direct, concise communication. And in addition to that, I want to say that I think there were really important advantages. There was maybe a little bit less energy because people were not able to play to the crowd. There was maybe a little bit less spontaneity, certainly fewer banners and cheers and balloons and confetti and some of the trappings that we come to expect of a convention. And on the other hand, I think there was more of an opportunity for a focused message speaking directly to the voters. And so we will have to see. Obviously, we've only seen one convention. We'll have to see the second convention. But I expect that there may be not only a sense that this convention was more impactful. And by the way, one of the things we could talk about for a moment is the ratings. I've not seen the ratings for last night. The ratings are a little down on the conventions. There's been a downward line for quite a while with less and less attention focused. But it still does appear to be that there were tens of millions of people watching these conventions over this convention over the last 4 nights. And so the ability for the convention to do its work depends on the number of people watching it. There were, it seems to me, sufficient people watching it, and then obviously the sound bites get played on the news and reverberate through the public sphere for the next news cycle. And I do think that the combination of the greater efficiency in communication and the greater number of people who could speak as a result, and then the capacity to include more ordinary people. Some of you may have seen the actual nominating vote in which each state, right, says our votes are this, and these were mainly ordinary people or local or state elected officials speaking in situ, in their actual location. And there was, I think, something quite compelling about that. So let me focus on what I take to be the single most important aspect of what we witnessed over the last 4 nights, and that is the tight unity of the Democratic Party at the current moment. And when I say the tight unity, I guess I would focus on 2 aspects of this. This is not necessarily the case in terms of policy, and clearly there is a fissure in the Democratic Party between newly emergent, more leftist Democrats, and the party as a whole is clearly moving in a more progressive, redistributive, activist, racial justice, climate activist direction. And on the other hand, it still has an important base that is more moderate, that reflects the work that Bill Clinton and Barack Obama did to move the party to the center. So there is a policy fissure in the Democratic Party, but that was not on display in this convention. As a matter of fact, it was the case that there was very little open disagreement. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez gave the nominating speech for Bernie Sanders and didn't mention Joe Biden once, right? And so you might see that as a implicit rebuke, but I think that's as close as you get. And please note that by historical standards, that's very modest. And so my question about the unity is it exclusively negative? Is this a party that is united in opposing the incumbent? And I think that the answer to that question is obviously, and obviously yes, and the depths of the opposition to Donald Trump, I think, are almost hard to fathom. And so we'll talk more about what, for instance, Barack Obama said, that Donald Trump is a threat to democracy. That's very damning language. And I think it's quite clear that he meant it, that this wasn't just a campaign ploy. So there is this very strong negative unity. But I also want to suggest that there is a positive element to the unity, and that is support for Joseph Biden. And so there was the moment last night where you had many of the rivals to Joe Biden from the nominating process having a conversation with each other, making it clear that they all are enthusiastic in their support for Joe Biden. And so Joe Biden did not run a negative campaign. He managed to be a transcendent candidate, if you will, someone who, despite not doing well at first, never really went on the attack. And the result is, I think, that there is less bitterness than there had been between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders in 2016. And it's easier to unify the party around the nominee as a result. And I do think there is a sense emerging out of this convention that Biden has the character, that he has the loyalty as a result of many people in the party, in part because of the personal relationships that he has with them and the trust in his character that those personal relationships have built. And so, again, I think there's a contrast with Hillary Clinton coming out of 2016. So let me just hit some of the highlights of the convention with you for a moment, and I'll be relatively brief. There were about 50 elected officials who spoke. And I just emphasize that for a moment. There were about 350 people who spoke in this convention. That's more than double the number of people who typically speak. 50 is an awful lot in terms of candidates. 300 ordinary people speaking is truly extraordinary. And so on the one hand, I want to say that the diversity of the Democratic Party was on display. You had Native American, you had African American, you had Latino American, you had working class white, and you had a fairly large number of Republican officials speaking as well, right? And so this was a big tent in terms of the candidates and officials who were given time on the virtual stage. And there were a large number of angles that they came at it from, right? The Republicans who spoke mainly focused on national security and their view that Donald Trump is a threat to the national security of the United States. The Democrats were diverse, and there were some people who were speaking in favor of a Green New Deal or aggressive action on climate change or gun control or job creation, right? And so some of the traditional policy elements of the Democratic platform, but please note that in no other Democratic nominating convention has climate change been front and center. And I'll transition into speaking about Biden's speech in a few minutes, but I would point out to you that Joe Biden suggested at the beginning of his speech that there are 4 national crises intersecting at the moment. And obviously the viral pandemic is one of them. And the economic consequences of the pandemic is another one. And the reckoning around racial inequality, especially but not exclusively with regards to the police, is a third. But he also mentioned climate change as being a crisis of the moment. And I just want to note that that is, I think, a little bit unanticipated and in fact may be extraordinary. And that the fact that California is once again burning, and that the California fire season, which usually heats up in October, has heated up in the middle of August this year. And that the fires burning in California have already exceeded the acreage damage, the number of acres scarred, have already exceeded the damage done last summer by the biggest fires, right? And this just exploded in the last few days. And you may have seen Gavin Newsom speaking on his cell phone from the middle of a forest in the Santa Cruz Mountains as he was driving from sheltering station to sheltering station, trying to comfort the people who've been displaced by the fires. I think that actually drove climate change to even greater prominence in this convention than it otherwise would have had. Now, the highlights. Michelle Obama's speech. And I would point out to you that it was a direct, forceful speech, and that both the Obamas were, in a sense, speaking to the legacy of Barack Obama, and that Michelle Obama, I think, was very direct in stating that she knows how hard the job is because she watched her husband do it for 8 years, and she has come to the conclusion, as obviously the Democrats want many Americans to come to the conclusion, that Donald Trump simply isn't up to the job. And it's not just that he can't manage the policy, that he is, as Michelle Obama put it, in over his head. It's also that he is incapable of unifying the country, even in the depths of a severe crisis, and incapable of providing the emotional leadership that we need as we cope with mass casualties. The New York Times estimates that more than 200,000 Americans have died in the last 6 months from the coronavirus. Please note that that's more than the Vietnam and the Korean and the Afghanistan and the Iraq wars put together. You can throw September 11th in there if you want, right? Then we're not counting deaths, but what we are noting is the enormity of the suffering. And Michelle Obama quoted Donald Trump's line when he was interviewed by Axios, asked about the extent of the casualties. He says, it is what it is, right? And there's a lack of emotional connection in that line, right? And so Michelle Obama did particular work in trying to explain that one of the things that the president has to do is to be the leader of the national family, if you will, to be the person who helps us cope with grief and suffering, and not only to devise policy that minimizes that grief and suffering to the minimal necessary, but then helps us get through it. And that that Donald Trump has failed that standard. Let me now push on to Barack Obama, who spoke from Philadelphia, Constitution Hall, and with the display in the background about the writing of the Constitution, and delivered, I thought, an extraordinarily powerful indictment, something that in a sense is unprecedented for the predecessor to attack the current inhabitant of the presidency in such strong language, to suggest that Donald Trump is not only incompetent, not only mismanaging the virus and the economy, not only so focused on himself and his own advantage that he does not pay attention to ordinary Americans and their needs, but an actual threat to the Constitution and democracy in the United States. And so that is, I think, unprecedented, right? In the sense that the president, the former president of the United States, is suggesting that the most significant threat to democracy is, in a sense, a deformed form of democracy itself, is the person that the people of the United States have elected and are considering re-electing. And part of Obama's point here is that Donald Trump has, on Obama's analysis, no respect for the rules of the game. He does not want to win exclusively and only through a fair competition, and to accept if the outcome of a fair competition is that he does not carry the day, then he has to step aside, accept the results. That is the way democracy works. As opposed to that, Obama is suggesting that Donald Trump is bending or breaking the rules of the game, trying to suppress votes, trying to attack the Postal Service to make it difficult for people to vote by mail, trying to distort the understanding of the relevant information, supporting and disseminating conspiracy theories with no basis in the facts, distorting information about the pandemic in order to advantage himself, even if it damages the nation's health. And so this is a very strong, direct attack. And I think, frankly, surprising in one sense, surprising because You don't see former presidents attacking current presidents in this way. But on another hand, I don't think particularly surprising. I think in a sense, this was Barack Obama's effort to say, this is the true stakes of this election. As Joe Biden put it in his acceptance speech, democracy itself is on the ballot. Kamala Harris was the chief speaker Wednesday night, accepted the nomination, introduced herself, introduced her family, spoke of the nation being at an inflection point. Now, I think one of the things that's striking about Kamala Harris's speech, if I've got it right, she didn't mention Donald Trump by name. She really took it as an opportunity to introduce herself. And I think one of the things to note here is that she did not succeed as a candidate for the Democratic national nomination, right? She ran, she did very poorly, she withdrew early. She had a mismanaged campaign, and not only that, she has a quite compelling story. She's the children of immigrants. She is biracial. She has come up in a sense as a representative of the American dream, of the new America, which is a multiracial democracy. She is obviously a woman, and the first woman of color, the first African-American woman to be nominated to be the vice presidential candidate. And so rather than speaking about the speech, which I think was a decent introductory speech, but not really doing the work that we expect a vice president to do in a presidential campaign, which is to be an aggressive attack dog on behalf of the president. And by the way, Kamala Harris has shown herself to be very capable at that as a prosecutor and then as a senator, cross-examining representatives of the Trump administration. We've seen her when it comes to Kavanaugh, et cetera, lay gloves on those she interrogates and debates. And so I think we can anticipate that this is one of the reasons Joe Biden chose her. But I think it's also the case that Joe Biden recognizes that the two critical demographics in both of Bill Clinton's and both of Barack Obama's victories in swing states in the United States have been white women and African-American women. And so choosing a woman, and in particular choosing a woman of color, who is not radical, but nevertheless may energize the base, was the safe, the sensible, the choice that made sense in terms of electoral calculus. And so in a sense, what Kamala Harris needed to do was to say, I'm here, get to know me a little bit. And I think she succeeded in doing that. Now, I have a fifth name down here, Braden Harrington, which I imagine many of you don't know who that is, or certainly didn't know who it was until last night. He's the young man, I should say boy, he's 13 years old, from New Hampshire, who speaks with a severe stutter, who Joe Biden took aside on his campaign in New Hampshire, introduced him to a book of poetry, gave him some lessons about how Biden himself overcame his stutter. And I think many of us found it touching that Braden Harrington read a speech on live national TV, despite the fact that he has a severe stutter, and that Joe Biden gave him 5 minutes of precious prime time television during a nominating convention to read his speech. And I want to point out that this represents something that I think is really quite exceptional about this convention, which is that we heard from nearly 300 ordinary Americans, many of whom were not polished, many of whom spoke from their kitchen tables or their living rooms or their fields or their public square. And that the sense that Joe Biden is trying to convey that he understands the situation of ordinary Americans, that he will give them a voice, that he will be attentive to their needs, that he is not a billionaire businessman and a reality TV star who is merely playing a role, that he actually takes the time to connect to people when he's on the campaign trail, to get to know them personally, to assist them in ways that have perhaps very little to do with electoral calculus. Braden Harrington can't vote, right? Braden Harrington didn't give a speech about Joe Biden. Braden Harrington is struggling to learn how to control his voice and speech, right? And when Donald Trump made fun of a disabled reporter in 2016, Joe Biden allowed a person with a disability to speak in his convention. And by the way, he also allowed a immigrant woman, an illegal immigrant or an undocumented immigrant with spina bifida to speak for several minutes. There's a contrast here that's deliberate. I'll just say one more thing. I think this also emphasized that Joe Biden himself has overcome hardship, overcome the loss of the job of his father, and recognizes that a job is not just about income, but also about social standing, about the ability to feel that one provides for one's family and that one contributes to one's society. And so showing a young man suffering and struggling and looking at him and saying that's where Joe Biden was at his age, I think is very effective. All right, give me just a minute to talk about Joe Biden's speech. And here, I have to say the stakes were very high. The expectations may not have been very high. Joe Biden has not been a particularly effective public speaker through much of his career in public life, despite the fact that he's been running for public office for 50 years, right? And this has to do with his speech impediment. It has to do with his proneness to gaffes. It just has to do probably with his strength, and it probably speaks to his perseverance and his skills in terms of policy, as well as connecting with people, that he has succeeded as well as he has succeeded without ever hitting a home run in a public speaking event. And I think last night was by far and away Joe Biden's strongest speech. And I'm not going to go into the details. I think in a sense I've spoken a lot about what it is that this convention tried to convey. And one of the things the nominee has to do when they accept the nomination is to tie it all together. And I think Joe Biden did that very convincingly. And what I want to speak to here for a moment is the way in which Joe Biden managed to connect two sets of themes. One of them is his personal attributes, his empathy, his toughness, his perseverance, and his hopefulness. This is his character, right? And it's rooted in his biography. And he emphasized that, but he tied it at the same time to his critique of Donald Trump, that Donald Trump has not had to overcome adversity, that Donald Trump has not developed the empathy and the capacity to console and comfort and find hope as a result. And so this connection between Joe Biden's biography and the contrast he's drawing with Donald Trump is the first, I think, very important thing in the speech that Joe Biden gave last night. The second thing that I think is extremely important is the balance he struck between indicting the president and indicating in a powerful way how problematic the situation that the country finds itself in at the moment is, how deep the pain is as a result of the virus, how much our ordinary lives have been disrupted, how little of the human connection that we rely on and take for granted remains as a result of the virus, and how deep the economic suffering is. And at the same time, to balance that with a message of hope, right? And he began with a quotation about leading to the light and spoke about the darkness, but also about this not being America, about this being an interruption of the trajectory of American society, and about the way he sees himself both as someone to right the course, to get us in a more hopeful, more decent, more compassionate place, and to serve as a bridge to the future. And so in all of these regards, I think this was a tremendously well-crafted and very well-delivered speech. And here I just want to return to the venue and the format for a moment. This felt like an Oval Office address to me, more than it felt like a convention speech. It was Joe Biden speaking to the camera, standing behind the podium, never interrupted, able to convey his passion, his determination, his hope, his compassion directly to the camera and the viewer. And so I do think that this was very effective. And to just preview for a moment what we have coming in the coming week, I would say to you that I think one of the challenges that the Republicans face will be how they perform in this venue, and in particular, how Donald Trump performs in this venue. Donald Trump has been less successful so far as a scripted teleprompter speaker. That's not been his strength. His strength has been as an arena speaker, channeling and amplifying the energy of the crowds that he addresses. That's not going to be available to him next week. I think the other thing that's really important is that the venue itself conveys the situation that we're in, that none of us can come together because the virus is still afoot and too dangerous. And so how do the Republicans manage the fact that their convention has been forced online precisely because the virus has been mismanaged and still is so dangerous in our society? Now, we've seen a little bit of the way in which Donald Trump is countering this. He bought, I believe, over $10 million worth of online and television advertising during the Democratic Nominating Convention. And that's extraordinary. Usually the opposition, the party not doing the nominating, lays low during this week. That clearly is not Trump or the Republicans' strategy at this point. And the ads that they're taking out are a frontal assault on what we saw in the convention. The suggestion is that Joe Biden is not on top of his game, that he is slow, that he is diminished, that he has lost a step due to age, and that he is captured, and that he's captured by the left of the Democratic Party, which is radical and which is engaged in an assault on the institutions that secure law and order in our society. And so that if elected, Joe Biden will bring in a new era of lawlessness and anarchy. That's the message so far. So far as the polling data I've shown you suggest, this message does not seem to be sticking, but it does seem to be amplified. And I'll just conclude today, when I talk about the state of the argument, let me put it in slightly different terms. I've spoken a lot about what Biden and the Democrats tried to convince you of this week. I've spoken a little bit about the counter argument that Trump is making. I'll point out to you that the other, I think, really interesting dynamic that this week has revealed is that Trump remains a base politician. He's not trying to reach out to a broader electorate. He's trying to motivate his core voters to come out and vote and try to either remove the motivation or the enthusiasm of the Democrats, or make it more difficult for them to vote so that they will not vote in large numbers. And the contrary, the case study opposite that Joe Biden is presenting is a broad-based strategy, really trying to reach as many people as possible, to build as broad a coalition as possible. I think one of the interesting things he said in his acceptance speech is, "I will represent you even if you don't vote for me." In a sense, that didn't need to be said in previous campaigns. But in light of what's happened in the country for the last 3.5+ years, Biden felt the need to emphasize that. All right, why don't I stop there? And I'm going to unmute everyone. Please be aware now that background noise will pick up. And or your comments. Who wants to start us out? Let me just ask, how many of you watched the convention either in part or in whole?
Yeah.
Let me get
Here. Yes.
Okay, so it looks like I can't see everybody, but it looks like at least half of you did watch the convention.
Absolutely.
Let me ask those of you who did, what did you think? Were you impressed? Were you disappointed? Was it interesting? Was it boring? Quick impressions, please.
Hello. Hello.
Yeah.
This is.
Hi, Ann.
Hi. I'm in my apartment. I thought it was very, very inspiring. If I could go out and vote today, I would do it. I don't know why but of course I'm not the right person to judge. But I thought that I was very impressed with Biden. I didn't expect such eloquence from him, and I did get it. I loved it.
It was a passionate speech, right? He was animated. Yeah. Debbie, go ahead.
I hope everything goes fine. Everything will.
Debbie, can you?
I'll talk to you later. I'll talk to you later. Here.
Okay, so I've muted everyone, and now I'm unmuting Debbie. But Debbie, you're going to have to hold your space bar down. Okay, there we go. I think, yeah. No, you're still muted. Can you hold your space bar down? Okay, let me try one more time. Debbie, now it's working. Go ahead.
I found it interesting. No one mentioned the Supreme Court and its role in the whole thing.
Yeah, good point. And I think you're absolutely right. And we'll have to see when Barack Obama says the Constitution and democracy are at stake. Maybe that's in part what he has in mind, but nobody made it explicit. And to be clear, I think the focus is really on Donald Trump and the handling of the coronavirus. And so in a sense, perhaps the urgency of that issue led to a neglect of the Supreme Court. It will be interesting to see. Obviously, among the things Joe Biden did was to pick the person who was most direct in attacking Kavanaugh to be his vice president. And so there's at least an implicit effort to bring that in. Anyone else with impressions? So that's a good point, Debbie. Thank you. All right, so how about questions or comments about the state of the election or what happened in the convention? Debbie, go ahead.
I found the convention lovely, and everyone spoke well, but I'm petrified. I think this country, I don't know what else we can do. I mean, it's so obvious to those of us who feel strongly about living in a democracy. But I'm scared.
Yeah, so I do think, yes, that in a sense, the argument made by Barack Obama, by Joe Biden, that Donald Trump is a unique threat to American democracy, in a sense, is too simplistic. That what is a threat to American democracy is not only Donald Trump, if you believe he is, but what's happening in the media, what's happening with online communication. You may have seen, I believe it's now 8 QAnon candidates got nominations from the Republicans. Many of them will probably win, right? QAnon is an online conspiracy theory that suggests there's a dark cabal in the deep state, that Donald Trump is the only person who understands and is fighting. It's based in total science fiction fabrication. And yet we've got candidates for national office who are winning their campaigns and likely going to go to Congress on this basis. And so I would say to you, yes, there's reasons to be scared. If you watch this on Fox News, and I did switch back and forth between CNN and Fox News a little bit, Fox News mainly spoke over the candidates, right? They did not let the convention simply be broadcast. They had their reporters and talking heads and newsreaders giving commentary the whole time. They confined the speaker to a side screen and muted them, right? And so if you're watching Fox News, you're not even seeing the convention. So I think if I've got you right, Debbie, you're asking in a sense, what more could a president do to disqualify himself than Donald Trump has already done? And how can it be that it's still the case that 40+% of the American public support him, and that's likely to close and get even tighter as the election proceeds? And I do think that is genuinely concerning. And part of what we've got to worry about is that we don't see the same news anymore, and that the idea that there's some regulation of how we communicate with each other, what is actually broadcast through our public sphere, has completely fallen by the wayside. QAnon is perhaps an extreme example, and QAnon believes in Pizzagate, believes that the Democrats in high office in the United States are engaged in sex trafficking, right? It's just awful, stupid, crazy stuff. And it circulates with the same degree of authority that the reports from Dr. Fauci do, right? And not only that, it does seem like many of us are taken in by it. And so, yes, I agree that this is a worrisome period. I do also have to say, as opposed to combating this or trying to damp this down, we have a president right now who, in my opinion, and I think where I stand. I don't pretend to objectivity, although I do try to give you unbiased analysis. A president who exacerbates this, who fans this, who exaggerates it, who facilitates it, who uses the worst aspects of the media to transmit the often worst conspiracy theories or most misinformative. Yeah, go ahead, Mary.
I just said who lies.
Who lies? Yeah.
Yes.
By the way, I want to say that you were absolutely wonderful today. You were in your explanation, because you said it all exactly how I feel. And I think a lot of these girls do also.
Thank you, Mary. I appreciate you saying that. I do my best to try to synthesize
And
things.
today you were absolutely wonderful. Not that you weren't before.
Thank you, Mary. Well, I'm going to start blushing if you keep going. So stop. Anybody with a question or a comment before we conclude for today?
Again, where is the Republican Party? Don't they see what Donald Trump is? How many of them go along with this?
Yeah, so I was speaking with one of my former students. This is somebody who I taught 20 years ago, who's off doing his own PhD right now. And he was saying how much he admired Barack Obama's speech, and I was saying I agree, and that it was a statesmanly address. And then I was wondering with him, how many people would it reach who aren't already convinced, right? And then I had the thought, it's a fantasy. What if George W. Bush would have joined Barack Obama in making those remarks, right? And so that mainstream former Republican president had also stood up to say, this is, and you remember what George W. Bush said during Trump's, first inaugural speech, his inaugural speech? He said, I quote, "Well, that's some crazy shit," right? And so he clearly doesn't support Donald Trump. It would have been interesting had a Republican of that stature joined Barack Obama or somebody else of that stature from the Democratic Party. But you may have seen there are over 70 former Republican national security officials who've signed a letter saying they're not voting for Donald Trump, and in fact, they're voting for Joe Biden. And by the way, the voting for Joe Biden bit is new. They said last time that they weren't voting for Trump, but they didn't say they were voting for Hillary Clinton. And I think we're seeing more and more of it among Republicans who are not in elected office. The Republicans who are in elected office are between a rock and a hard place, assuming that they're not just all in with Donald Trump, which some of them are, right? And they're between a rock and a hard place because Donald Trump still controls the base of the party. And so I happen to think that he's driving them very fast down a dead end street. And I will,
he is dangerous.
Pardon?
I said he is dangerous.
He is dangerous for the country, and we're paying the cost right now. I think he may also ultimately be dangerous for his own political party, because more and more people are just lost to the Republicans, especially younger people under 30 just can't abide this. But it's also the case that the white suburban women who have been absolutely integral to the electoral victories that the Republicans have had are increasingly souring on Donald Trump, and maybe souring on the Republican Party as a whole.
He is another Billy Stark. Do you remember the movie, All the King's Men?
Of course.
That's Donald Trump.
Yes, yes. Debbie, why don't I give you the last comment for today? Debbie, are you able to?
No.
Okay. Oh, I thought you were raising your hand. All right. Really good talking with you. And next week, we'll get to analyze the Republican convention. Take care,
Okay.
everybody.
Thank
Please
you.
continue to be vigilant. Things look good in New York right now, but remember, what we see is 10 days out of date. So let's just keep being careful, okay?
Okay.
All right, everybody. Take care. See you next week. Bye-bye.
Right, bye-bye.